The family meeting was scheduled for a Saturday morning in November, which I thought was deliberate. My mother always preferred to deliver bad news in daylight. She said it made things feel more official, more final. I drove 40 minutes from Austin to my parents' home in Marble Falls, Texas. The same drive I had made 100 times over my 34 years. Past the cedar breaks and the limestone outcroppings, past the cattle gate with the rusted W brand my grandfather had welded himself in 1962. Past the east pasture where my grandmother, Dorothy Mae Winston, had taught me to identify wildflowers by Latin name when I was 7 years old. I knew what the meeting was about. My brother Caleb had called me the week before, not to talk but to warn me. "Mom's made her decision," he said. "Just wanted you to hear it from me first." There was no kindness in it. It was theater. He wanted to watch my reaction in real time. I told him I appreciated the heads up and ended the call. What neither Caleb nor my mother nor my father knew, what no one in that house knew except my grandmother's private attorney and me, was that Dorothy Mae Winston had already made her decision 4 years earlier. On a Tuesday afternoon in November 2019, sitting at her kitchen table with a notary and 2 witnesses, she had signed a quit-claim deed transferring the entire Winston Estate to me. Every acre. Every structure. Every dollar of it. The meeting was already over before it began. My family just didn't know that yet. To understand what happened that Saturday, you need to understand what the Winston Estate actually is, and what my family turned it into. The property sits on 847 acres of Texas hill country outside Marble Falls. My grandfather, Harold Winston, built the main house in 1971 with his own hands and the hands of 3 hired men. Limestone walls, cedar beam ceilings, a wraparound porch that faces west so you can watch the sun drop behind the hills every evening without obstruction. Over 40 years, Harold added a guest cottage, a working barn, a small private lake stocked with bass, and 12 acres of irrigated pecan orchard that produced commercially until 2015. When Harold died in 2014, he left everything to my grandmother Dorothy. That was never disputed. What became disputed, quietly then loudly, was what Dorothy would do with it when her own time came. My brother Caleb is 4 years older than me. He is handsome in the way that photographs well, which served him throughout our childhood. He was my parents' undisputed favorite from the time I was old enough to notice such things. He received the new car at 16. The college tuition without conditions. The down payment on his first house in San Antonio, which my parents called a loan and never collected. When Caleb graduated with a business degree he never used professionally, my father threw him a party in the backyard with a live band and 60 guests. When I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in estate and trust law 3 years later, my mother made a nice dinner. I am not telling you this to generate sympathy. I am telling you this because it is relevant to what my grandmother saw and what she decided to do about it. Dorothy Winston was sharper at 81 than most people are at 40. She read 3 newspapers daily. She managed her own investment accounts until the year she died. She noticed everything and said little, which people frequently mistook for frailty. It was not frailty. It was precision. She noticed that Caleb visited her primarily when he needed something. She kept a mental record. Later she told me she had kept a written one, of the calls requesting money, the borrowed equipment never returned, the excuses for missing her birthday 2 years running. She noticed that when he did visit he spent most of his time walking the property with his hands in his pockets, looking at things the way a man looks at things he is calculating the value of. She noticed that I came on the second Sunday of every month and stayed the full day. That I weeded the pecan orchard with her in the spring. That I drove her to her cardiologist appointments in Burnett and sat in the waiting room with a book. That when she wanted to talk about Harold I listened without checking my phone. She never made a show of noticing any of this. She simply drew her conclusions and acted on them the way she did everything. In the spring of 2019, Dorothy called me on a Wednesday evening and asked if I would come by the following Saturday. She said she wanted to discuss something. I came. She made coffee and set out the pecan cookies she kept in a tin on the second shelf of her pantry, and then she slid a manila folder across the kitchen table and asked me to read it. It was a draft quit-claim deed. Her name in the grantor line. My name in the grantee line. The legal description of all 847 acres and every structure on the property. I looked up at her. I said, "Grandma, are you sure about this?" She looked at me with an expression I can only describe as settled. like a woman who had already done the math and was finished doing it. She said, "I've been sure since your brother asked me what the land appraised for at Christmas. He thought I didn't hear him. I heard him." We sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "You have always come here because you wanted to be here. Not because of this." She gestured at the window at the property beyond it. "That matters to me. That is worth something." I asked her if she wanted to speak with my attorney. She said she already had her own, thank you. She said she had engaged a private estate attorney in Austin, not the family attorney my parents used, whom she did not trust with anything she wanted kept quiet, and that the paperwork was already prepared. She had waited to show it to me because she wanted to see my face when I read it. She wanted to make sure I wasn't like Caleb, that I wouldn't start calculating. I wasn't calculating. I was trying not to cry in my grandmother's kitchen. She signed the quitclaim deed in November 2019 before a licensed Texas notary and 2 witnesses. The deed was filed with Burnett County within the week. From that day forward, the Winston Estate belonged to me under Texas property law. Dorothy retained the right to live there for the remainder of her natural life, a life estate clause she had specifically requested, but ownership had transferred completely and irrevocably. She made me promise 2 things. First, that I would not tell my parents until after she was gone. She did not want her final years spent defending a decision she had already made. Second, that I would take care of the pecan orchard. She said Harold would not forgive either of us if those trees were neglected. I kept both promises. Dorothy died in August of the following year peacefully in the main house bedroom where she had slept for 49 years. I was there. My parents were not. Caleb was at a golf tournament in Scottsdale. The family called it a tragedy. What they meant was that the clock had started. In the 14 months between Dorothy's death and the Saturday family meeting, I did 3 things simultaneously. The first was grief. I want to be clear about that because the rest of this story moves quickly and efficiently and might give the impression that I was operating purely in strategy mode. I was not. Dorothy Winston was the person in my family who had seen me most clearly, and losing her was a loss I carried every day. I planted 2 new pecan trees on the east edge of the orchard the month after she died. One for her and one for Harold. That was not strategy. That was love. The second thing I did was retain legal counsel. I had my own estate law background, but I engaged Margaret Okonkwo, a senior trust and property attorney at a firm in Austin with 30 years of Texas real estate experience, to review every document, verify the county filing and prepare for whatever challenge my family might mount when the deed became known. Margaret reviewed the quitclaim filing, confirmed it was airtight under Texas law, and prepared a comprehensive legal brief covering every likely challenge including undue influence, diminished capacity and procedural defect. She found no grounds for any of them. Dorothy had been assessed by her physician as fully cognitively competent 6 weeks before signing. The notarization was clean. The county filing was time-stamped and irrefutable. The third thing I did was manage the property. Quietly and completely. From the month after Dorothy's death, I contracted a property management firm in Marble Falls to maintain the grounds, service the structures and manage the pecan orchard through its annual harvest cycle. The 2020 harvest produced 4,200 pounds of commercial-grade pecans. The 2021 harvest produced 4,800 pounds. I deposited the proceeds into a dedicated property account in my name and kept detailed records of every dollar in and every dollar out. My parents believed the estate was sitting dormant, waiting for the family to sort out the inheritance. They had engaged the family attorney, a man named Gerald Pruitt who had handled my father's business affairs for 20 years, to begin the probate process. Gerald Pruitt had no idea the property had already transferred 4 years earlier. He was working from Dorothy's public will, which left the estate to the family trust for distribution. What no one had told Gerald Pruitt, because no one knew to tell him, was that a quitclaim deed recorded before a person's death supersedes any will provision regarding that specific property. The property was never part of Dorothy's estate to distribute. It had been mine since November 2019. I let the process move forward. I watched Gerald Pruitt file paperwork for a property that was not his client's to file for. I watched my mother call family meetings and distribute printed agendas. I watched Caleb begin telling people at his golf club that he was coming into a significant inheritance in the Texas Hill Country. Margaret Okonkwo told me I could have intervened at any point. She said I could have sent a single letter to Gerald Pruitt and stopped the whole proceeding in 48 hours. I told her I wanted to wait for the family meeting. She asked me why. I told her the truth. Because Dorothy had spent 30 years being dismissed by these people, and I wanted them to hear it in a room together at a table, the way they had gathered to divide what they thought was hers. Margaret said that was understandable. Then she said to make sure she was in the room when it happened. She was. The invitation to the family meeting came from my mother by text message, which told me everything about how seriously she was taking my presence there. A text. Not a call. Not a written letter the way Dorothy would have sent. A text that read, "Family meeting Saturday 10 a.m. Estate matters. Please be on time." I replied, "I'll be there." Caleb called me 2 days later, and I could hear in his voice that he had already spent the inheritance. Not literally but mentally. He had already furnished the rooms in his mind. Already told his wife Brittany about the west pasture and the private lake. Already, I suspect, begun researching what 847 acres of hill country land appraised for in the current market. "You know how Mom is," he said. "She just wants everything settled cleanly. No drama." "I understand," I said. "And look, I know this isn't what you were hoping for. But Grandma was closest to me toward the end. You know that. She told Mom herself." I let that sit for a moment. Dorothy, who had asked me not to tell my phone that she was in the hospital so that Caleb wouldn't find out and feel obligated to cut his golf trip short. Dorothy, who had described Caleb to me once without malice as a man who confuses being loved with being owed. I thought about all of that. Then I said, "I'll see you Saturday, Caleb." He said, "Good. Let's keep it civil." I agreed that we would. The morning of the meeting I dressed in a charcoal blazer and drove to Marble Falls with 2 things in my bag. The first was a copy of the quit-claim deed, notarized and certified by Burnett County. The second was a 12-page forensic accounting summary that Margaret had commissioned 3 weeks earlier. A quiet audit of all property-related transactions processed through the family attorney's trust account since Dorothy's death. What it revealed was that Caleb had already submitted invoices totaling $47,200 to the estate account for what he described as property oversight and management services. For a property he had visited twice in 14 months, according to the property management firm's gate logs. I put both documents in a manila folder and set it on the passenger seat. Margaret Okonkwo was already parked outside my parents' house when I arrived. She had driven from Austin and was drinking coffee from a travel mug, reading something on her tablet. She looked up when I pulled in, gave me a single nod and got out of her car. My mother saw us approaching from the front window. I watched her face change, just briefly, a flicker of something, when she saw that I had not come alone. She opened the door before we knocked. "Who is this?" she said. "My attorney," I said. "She's here to assist with the estate discussion." My mother's jaw tightened. "This is a family meeting." "Yes," I said. "It is." The dining room table had been set up the way my mother arranged things when she wanted to signal authority. A printed agenda at each seat. Water glasses. A yellow legal pad at Caleb's place. Gerald Pruitt, the family attorney, sat at the far end with his own folders arranged in a neat stack. My father sat to my mother's right, which was his customary position. Caleb sat directly across from me with Brittany beside him, her presence unannounced and, I suspected, strategic. A witness. An audience. My mother had not placed a chair for Margaret. Margaret pulled one from against the wall and sat beside me without comment. Gerald Pruitt looked at Margaret the way attorneys look at other attorneys they haven't been warned about. He leaned slightly toward my mother and said something quiet. My mother shook her head. Gerald Pruitt straightened his folders. "We're here to finalize the distribution of Dorothy Winston's estate," my mother began, reading from the agenda. "The estate includes the Marble Falls property, 847 acres. Appraised at $5.1 million as of June of this year, along with associated structures and agricultural assets. Gerald has completed the probate review and the family has reached a decision." She looked at me when she said, "the family," in the particular way she had always used that phrase, as a perimeter, not an invitation. Caleb leaned back in his chair. He had the posture of a man who had already won. "Before Gerald presents the distribution," my mother continued, "I want to say for the record that Dorothy's wishes were clear to those of us who were closest to her in her final years." She paused. "The estate goes to Caleb. That is what she wanted. That is what this family has decided. She looked at me. I know that's not what you were hoping, Claire. But your grandmother was closer to Caleb. You always pushed her away. You were always too busy with your career, your Austin life. Caleb was present. Caleb's mouth curved slightly. He had the grace not to smile fully. I looked at my mother. Then at Gerald Pruitt. Then at Margaret, who gave me nothing. No expression, no signal, because she didn't need to. I folded my hands on the table. I said, I understand. Please continue. My mother nodded, satisfied. Gerald Pruitt opened his top folder. He cleared his throat. He began reciting the legal description of the property. The same legal description that had appeared on a quitclaim deed filed with Burnett County in November 2019. Margaret uncapped her pen. Gerald Pruitt was 4 sentences into the property description when Margaret set her briefcase on the table and opened it. The sound, the 2 brass latches releasing in sequence, was quiet. But it was enough. Gerald Pruitt stopped mid-sentence. My mother looked over. My father, who had not spoken since I arrived, straightened in his chair. I apologize for the interruption, Margaret said. She did not sound apologetic. She sounded like a woman who had said those words in courtrooms and conference rooms for 30 years and meant them as a courtesy, not a concession. My name is Margaret Okonkwo. I'm a senior trust and estate attorney with Okonkwo and Associates in Austin. I represent Claire Winston in matters related to the Dorothy Mae Winston property holdings. She paused. Before this meeting continues, I have a legal obligation to disclose a recorded instrument that directly affects the distribution being discussed. My mother's chin lifted. We have our own attorney present. Whatever you have can go through Gerald. It can, Margaret agreed. But it cannot be ignored regardless of how it's presented. And given that Gerald has been processing a probate that involves this property, I think he'll want to hear this as well. She looked at Gerald Pruitt with the specific professional expression of one attorney delivering difficult news to another. I don't believe you were made aware of this filing, Gerald. I reviewed the probate record. You weren't. Gerald Pruitt set down his pen. My mother said, we have already made our decision as a family. Dorothy wanted Caleb to have the estate. That was her wish. Dorothy's wish, Margaret said, is documented. She placed a certified copy of the quitclaim deed on the table. Face up, clearly legible, the Burnett County filing stamp visible at the top right corner. This is a quitclaim deed executed by Dorothy Mae Winston on November 14, 2019, before a licensed Texas notary and 2 witnesses. It transfers full ownership of the Marble Falls property, all 847 acres and every structure thereon, to Claire Winston. She slid it toward the center of the table. It was recorded with Burnett County on November 19, 2019. It is a matter of public record. It has been a matter of public record for 4 years. The room was silent. Caleb was the first to react. He laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. That's not real, he said. Grandma would never have done that without telling the family. She was not legally required to tell the family, Margaret said. A quitclaim deed requires only the grantor, the grantee, a notary, and the county recorder's office. Dorothy fulfilled all 4 requirements. She had dementia, my mother said. Her voice had changed. The authority had drained out of it and something sharper had replaced it. In her final years she was not fully. Dorothy Winston was evaluated by her physician, Dr. Anita Chambers at Burnett County Medical, on September 30, 2019, Margaret said, placing a second document on the table. 6 weeks before signing. The evaluation documents full cognitive competency. Dr. Chambers's notes specifically indicate, and I am quoting directly, patient demonstrates clear recall, sound judgment, and consistent orientation. No cognitive impairment detected. She let that sit. I have the full evaluation here if Gerald would like to review it. Gerald Pruitt reached for it. My mother put her hand on his arm. He stopped. This is a manipulation, my mother said. She was looking at me now. Not at Margaret. At me. You manipulated a lonely old woman into signing over her property. You were always calculating. You were always. Mom, I said quietly. Don't. Her voice cracked. Don't you sit there, and she was my mother. She was my mother and you took advantage. Dorothy came to me, I said. She showed me the draft deed. I asked her if she was sure. She said yes. I did not ask her to do this. I did not suggest it. I did not manipulate anything. I paused. She told me she had been thinking about it since the Christmas Caleb asked her what the property appraised for. Caleb's face changed. It was the first time I had seen Caleb's face change like that. Not the polished displeasure of a man who doesn't get what he wants, but something underneath it. Something that knew I was telling the truth. That's not, he started. She heard you, I said. She didn't say anything. But she heard you. The silence that followed was different from the first one. The first silence had been shock. This one was reckoning. My father spoke for the first time. His voice was low. Claire, did you know about this the whole time? Since 2019, I said. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. And the property has been yours since then. Since November 19, 2019. Yes. He looked at the deed. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. My mother had not stopped looking at me. You let us go through all of this. The probate. The meetings. All of it. You let us. Dorothy asked me not to say anything until after the family had gathered, I said. She wanted it disclosed properly in a room with legal representation present. Those were her specific instructions to Margaret. My mother turned to Margaret. That's not true. I have Dorothy's written instructions to my office dated July 2020, 1 month before her death, Margaret said, and placed the third document on the table. She anticipated this gathering. She asked that I be present for it. Caleb pushed back from the table. He stood up. His chair scraped against the hardwood. This is insane. You can't, Gerald, tell me she can't just. Gerald Pruitt was reading the quitclaim deed. He read it once. Then he turned to page 2 and read that. Then he set it down and folded his hands in the particular way attorneys fold their hands when they are about to deliver information that no one in the room wants to hear. The deed is valid, he said. Under Texas property law, a properly executed and recorded quitclaim deed transfers ownership at the time of recording. The property transferred to Claire in November 2019. It was not part of Dorothy's estate at the time of her death. It cannot be distributed through probate because it was not Dorothy's to distribute. He paused. I was not made aware of this filing when I was engaged to handle the estate. Had I been, I would have advised the family accordingly. My mother said, Gerald. There's nothing to be done with the property distribution, Linda, he said quietly. That matter is settled. Brittany, who had not spoken once during the entire meeting, gathered her purse from the back of her chair and stood up. Margaret produced one final document and placed it in the center of the table. There is one additional matter, she said. This is a forensic accounting summary of transactions processed through the estate account between September 2020 and October 2021. The summary identifies $47,200 in invoices submitted by Caleb Winston for, quote, property oversight and management services. She looked at Caleb. The property management firm Claire retained in September 2020 maintains gate access logs. During the period covered by those invoices, those logs show 2 visits by Caleb Winston, totaling approximately 4 hours of on-site time. The room went very still. That's a billing discrepancy of $47,200, Margaret said, against an estate account, which is a matter for the probate court. She capped her pen. Gerald will know what to report and when. Caleb's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Brittany walked out of the dining room. We heard the front door open and close. The meeting formally concluded 14 minutes after Margaret placed the forensic accounting summary on the table. Gerald Pruitt gathered his folders with the deliberate efficiency of a man managing his own liability. He shook my hand on the way out and said in a voice too low for my parents to hear, I wish someone had told me. I told him I understood. He left without speaking to Caleb. Caleb did not leave immediately. He sat at the table after everyone else had stood, looking at the quitclaim deed as though prolonged examination might change its contents. My mother stood at the window with her back to the room. My father had moved to the kitchen doorway and stood there with his arms crossed, not in the combative way he sometimes crossed them, but in the way of a man who needed something solid to hold himself against. Caleb finally spoke. He said, Mom could contest this. On what grounds? I said. He didn't answer. Because there were no grounds. He knew there were no grounds. The cognitive evaluation was dated. The notarization was clean. Dorothy's written instructions to Margaret's office predated her death by a month and were specific in their directives. There was no angle from which the deed was vulnerable, and Caleb understood law well enough to know it, despite never having used his business degree professionally. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 34 years of being his sister. Something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it. Something that knew. "She really told you about Christmas," he said. "She told me," I said. He nodded once. Then he walked out. My mother remained at the window for a long moment after he left. When she turned around, she did not look like the woman who had sat at the head of that table 40 minutes earlier with her printed agenda and her water glasses and her certainty. She looked smaller. Not weak. My mother was not a weak woman, but diminished in the specific way people are diminished when they discover the story they have been telling themselves does not match the record. She said, "Did she leave you a letter?" "Dorothy. Did she say anything?" "She left me a letter, yes." "What did it say?" I thought about the letter. About Dorothy's handwriting, precise and slightly forward-leaning, the way she had been taught in school in 1952. About the last paragraph which I had read so many times I no longer needed the paper. "She said she trusted me to take care of what she built," I said. "And she said she hoped someday the family would understand why she did what she did." My mother looked out the window at the empty driveway where Caleb's truck had been. She said nothing. My father said quietly, "What happens now, Claire?" What happened next unfolded over the following months with the procedural steadiness that legal matters tend to have when the documentation is solid and the facts are not in dispute. Gerald Pruitt filed the required disclosure with the probate court within 2 weeks of the meeting. The forensic accounting summary was submitted as a supporting exhibit. The court opened an inquiry into the $47,200 in invoices. Caleb retained his own attorney and initially maintained that the charges were legitimate consulting fees. When Margaret's office produced the gate access logs alongside 3 years of property management invoices showing every legitimate maintenance expense had been handled by the contracted firm, Caleb's attorney advised him to cooperate. He repaid the estate account in full in February, plus court-assessed interest. No criminal charges were filed, in part because I asked Margaret not to pursue them. That was my decision, and I made it deliberately. Not for Caleb's sake. For my grandmother's. She had not wanted this to become a spectacle. She had wanted it resolved. The Winston Estate was formally confirmed as my property in county records in December. I had already been managing it for over a year at that point, so operationally nothing changed. I renewed the property management contract, scheduled the east pasture fencing for repair, and commissioned a structural review of the guest cottage, which had developed a foundation issue Dorothy had been meaning to address. The pecan orchard produced its best harvest in 6 years that fall. 5,100 pounds. I donated half of it to a food bank in Burnett County that Dorothy had supported for 20 years. The other half I sold commercially. I deposited the proceeds into the property account and sent my grandmother's preferred church a check with a note that said it was from her. My father called me in January. Not about the estate. That subject had been addressed and was finished. He called to ask if he could come out to the property in the spring, to walk the east pasture the way he and Harold used to. I told him yes. He came in April with his boots and his old field hat, and we walked the whole fence line without talking much, which was the best conversation my father and I had ever had. My mother has not called. I do not expect her to soon. I understand her position, even if I do not accept her version of events. She loved Dorothy and believed she knew what Dorothy wanted, and she was wrong, and that is a difficult thing to hold. I am willing to wait. What I am not willing to do is pretend that the decision my grandmother made was anything other than what it was. A clear-eyed act by a clear-minded woman who spent 81 years building something and wanted to know before she left that it would be held by someone who understood its value. Not the appraised value. Not the $5.1 million. The other kind. The kind Harold had welded into the gate in 1962. The kind that doesn't transfer with a deed. The kind you either understand or you don't. Dorothy knew which one of us understood it. He was right.